As philosophers, we're concerned with discovering truth. We've seen that instinctive reasoning is not all that reliable, but that careful reasoning can reveal truth. We have learned the basics of the two forms of careful reasoning, deductive and inductive. But we have yet to explore what many consider our most reliable guide to truth, abduction, or inference to the best explanation. Although Sir Arthur Conan Doyle called it deduction, abduction was actually Sherlock Holmes' method of choice when it came to solving crimes. House MD, who was modeled after Holmes, get it, House, Holmes, also used abduction, as did, by the way, the medical school professor on whom Doyle modeled Sherlock Holmes. In fact, abduction is very common in the medical field. Every medical diagnosis is an inference to the best explanation. Most notably, however, it is through abduction that major advances in scientific knowledge are made. We accept a new theory when we realize that it's the better explanation for the known facts. And nothing has expanded our knowledge of the world more than science. This is why so many think that abduction is our most reliable guide to truth. Thomas Huxley said, "Science is simply common sense at its best." And in a sense, he's right. Abductive reasoning is, in many ways, just common sense. To modify one of Huxley's own examples, if you came downstairs to find your window open and your silverware missing, you'd conclude that you were robbed and called the police. That's obviously the best explanation. You wouldn't think a ghost was the culprit and hold a silverware recovery seance. But, contrary to Huxley's suggestion, abduction actually goes against common sense in many ways. As we've seen, the common sense reasoning we apply instinctively is very often wrong. If you take an experimental medication and then feel better, common sense would tell you that the medication works, right? But in reality, that's only one data point. It's an anecdote, and it doesn't prove anything. Correlation doesn't imply causation. In fact, science was developed as a method for circumventing the ways common sense can lead us astray. And our common sense doesn't do so well only through instinctive reasoning. We commonly think that what we experience and remember is true, but our senses and memory lead us astray more often than intuitive reasoning does. Our experience of the world often fails to reflect the way it actually is. Let's start off with our sense of sight. First of all, outside ideal conditions, in cases of darkness or stress or intense emotion or chaotic environment or a lack of sleep or too much booze or too little water or too little food, our sight can very easily lead us astray. Illnesses and injuries can make us see what's not there. In fact, even in healthy people, in normal circumstances, they can hallucinate. That's not the only way our sight can lead us astray. Take optical illusions, for example. You see a false body of water like a mirage. You can see an image as moving when it's actually static. You can see two different surfaces as different colors or sizes when in fact they're the same. I could go on and on. But optical illusions are just the start. Our depth perception is also notoriously unreliable, especially when we're looking at something against a large open background, like the sky. Once, a local news reporter in Denver thought a camera in a field had caught giant UFOs flying over downtown Denver, when in reality it was just some out-of-focus bugs flying close to the camera. You might just conclude that she wasn't too bright, but in reality this kind of mistake can happen to the best of us. In one instance, 2 airline pilots and 1 National Guard fighter pilot, while in flight, thought they spotted a whole squadron of UFOs that was so close that it almost hit them. Turned out, and this was verified, it was a fragmenting meteorite that was at least 125 miles away. Without a point of reference, anyone can easily mistake a large faraway object for a smaller object close by. Worse still, we often simply see what we expect to see. Ever looked at a broken wall clock but had to stare at it for a while before you realized it wasn't moving? Ever think you see a person when it's really something else, like a trash bag? I constantly see my dog out of the corner of my eye when in reality he's upstairs asleep. Studies have actually shown that you can make people see a certain stimulus, like a flashing light, if you simply tell them to expect to see it. Confirmation bias affects how we see arguments. What philosophers call expectation bias affects how we see the world. Another common effect of this bias is called pareidolia, when we take vague stimuli and impose a pattern on them, thus seeing something that is not really there. Like when someone sees the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich, or Jesus in a bucket of pizza sauce, or a human face on a Martian mountain. A large portion of our brain is predisposed to see faces, and so we tend to see them everywhere, even where they're not. Interestingly, pareidolia is not only a visual phenomenon. We'll also hear words and phrases simply because we expect to. Like when you hear someone say something they didn't actually say. Or take backmasking, for example, when you play a song backwards to hear secret messages. Playing Queen's Another One Bites the Dust backwards supposedly sounds like, "It's fun to smoke marijuana." But the truth is, when you play songs backwards, you won't hear anything unless you expect to. In my classes, I play Beatles songs backwards without letting students know what they're supposed to hear. And they just hear gibberish. But when I let them see what words the conspiracy theorists say you're supposed to hear, everyone hears them clear as day. But that leads to a more general point. Everything I have said about sight and hearing applies to our other senses as well. Ever felt like something bit you when it didn't? Ever tasted something you usually like but you thought it was gross simply because it wasn't what you were expecting? Ever felt your cell phone vibrate in your pocket when it wasn't even in your pocket? I bet if I showed you a bunch of little tiny bugs crawling all over you right now, you might feel like little tiny bugs are crawling all over you. Our expectations determine a large portion of our experience. And this even expands beyond our senses. Our memory is not that reliable either. Not only do our expectations determine what we remember, for example, we'll remember evidence that confirms what we believe and forget what doesn't, but certain kinds of things are simply more memorable than others. This is why it always seems that you're always stuck in the slow lane during traffic jams. Being in the slow lane ticks you off. You're there for a long time, and you'll stew about it all day. But the fast lane, it's easy. You're not there for long, and you'll likely forget about it after about a mile. So when you think back on all the traffic jams you've ever been in, which ones do you remember? But strictly speaking, you're in the fast lane just as often. You just don't remember it. Worse still, the process of remembering is itself not that reliable. When we experience something, we don't record it like a video camera. We store the basics and we disregard the details. Then, when we think about it later, we recall the basics but confabulate the details. When we recall it yet again, we can end up thinking one of those confabulated details happened because we just aren't recalling the first time the event occurred. We're actually recalling the last time that we recalled it. In this way, over time, a memory can become completely inaccurate. Think about how sometimes rewatching a movie reveals that you completely misremembered what happened in the movie. The unreliable nature of our memory and senses is why eyewitness testimony is often not trusted in the courtroom. Especially in high-stress situations, people simply don't see what happens that accurately. And when they try to remember what happened, they'll do everything from simply confusing important details to just flat out making stuff up. They're not lying, they really do remember it that way, it's just that their memory has led them astray. These shortcomings are also the primary motivation for the development and utilization of science. Science is designed to guard against the many ways our intuitive reasoning, memory, and senses lead us astray. Like I mentioned before, when we're sick, but feel better after taking a new pill? Well, we then use the correlation fallacy to conclude that the medicine worked. In reality, it could have just been the placebo effect. We just felt better because we expected it to work. Or maybe it was something else that we did and we just don't remember doing it. Or maybe we were already on the mend. To tell which medications actually work, we have to guard against these kinds of mistakes. How? Well, how do we guard against these mistakes? You do a blind placebo-controlled study. First, you give the pill to a large group called the experimental group because it's unlikely that they're all on the mend. Then, to guard against the placebo effect, you give another group a sugar pill, but tell them that it's the real medication. They're called the control group. Then, you look to see if more people in the experimental group than in the control group got better. If they did, the medication likely works. Well, actually, not even that is enough. To guard against the expectation bias, the person looking at the results can't know which participants were in which group until they've all been examined. We call this double blinding the study. And you also need others to do the same study and get the same results to make sure no other mistakes slipped in. This is called replication. Only after all this can we be justified in concluding that the medication works. Only then is that the best explanation for the experimental results. This is why it takes so long to get FDA approval for most drugs. You can't just take it and see if you got better. This is true of just about any new scientific study or experiment, and it's a major strength of the scientific process. Conclusions that can be rightfully said to be supported by science are not derived from one person's unreliable experience. They are derived from the work of an entire community, a community that is aware of the kinds of errors we're apt to commit and that makes specific and careful efforts to guard against them. Sometimes people think that science constantly wavers on topics. What they say is healthy to eat today, tomorrow will be bad for you. And that may occasionally happen. But to the greatest extent, it's the media's fault that people have this impression of science, because reporters often tout the results of a single study as if it were what science says before the study has been confirmed and the scientific consensus on it has emerged. If replication reveals that the experiment was faulty, it can look like science is backtracking, when in fact, that's just the scientific community guarding against the ways our senses, memory, and instinctive reasoning can lead us astray. In reality, scientific knowledge has consistently improved over time and progressed toward an accurate understanding of the world. And it does so by using abduction to find better and better explanations. And that brings us back around to the question of this lecture. How do we find the best explanation? This is a very popular topic in the philosophy of science, and the most important work on this issue was done by Charles Sanders Peirce, who coined the term abduction, John Stuart Mill in A System of Logic, Karl Popper in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, and Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But for my money, the most straightforward articulation of abduction comes from a textbook that I use in class. Theodore Schick and Louis Vaughn's book, How to Think About Weird Things. According to Schick and Vaughn, abduction uses 5 criteria: testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, and conservatism. When figuring out what the best explanation is, you consider 2 or more hypotheses and then compare them based on these criteria. Whichever one fits best overall is the best explanation. But what do these criteria mean and how do we apply them? Well, let's take them one at a time. First, testability. To test a hypothesis, you predict what you would expect to observe if that hypothesis were true in certain conditions, and then see if that prediction comes true in those conditions. And it doesn't have to be a lab experiment. I can test my hypothesis that it's windy outside by simply looking outside the window and looking for swaying trees. Testability can be tricky, however. In order for a hypothesis to truly be testable in a way that will advance our knowledge, it must predict something currently unknown. Let me modify an example from Schick and Vaughn to demonstrate this. Suppose I'm trying to explain why the long glass tubes in my classroom emanate light. One hypothesis is that the tubes contain tiny gremlins with pickaxes who, when they hear the click of a light switch, start chipping away with their pickaxes at the glass, creating sparks. Now, to test this hypothesis, I might flip the switch, see the lights turn on, and see, I told you, gremlins! The lights came on just as I predicted. But in reality, I didn't predict anything. I already knew that the lights would come on when the light switch was flicked. That's actually what I was trying to explain. So I can't count that as evidence. What I need to do is predict some new phenomenon, like upon putting a broken glass light fixture under a microscope, I will observe tiny gremlins. Seeing that would be evidence in favor of my hypothesis. And in that way, the gremlin hypothesis is testable. Now, of course, it will fail that test. I'm not going to see the tiny gremlins, but at least it is testable. Suppose, however, that I tweak the hypothesis to save it from this evidence. The light bulb gremlins are actually invisible. That's why you can't see them under the microscope. This would realign the hypothesis with our observation, but it would also make the hypothesis untestable. Well, I suppose you could pour the contents of the light bulb into boiling water and listen for tiny screams, but when we don't hear any screams, we could still say, well, they're invisible and they're mute too. Changing a hypothesis after it gets its predictions wrong to align it with the evidence in a way that itself cannot be tested is called making an ad hoc or improvised excuse. It is obviously irrational and makes the hypothesis you're trying to protect worthless. Whereas the original gremlin hypothesis was at least testable, the invisible mute gremlin hypothesis is not, and thus it does not deserve serious consideration. A person making ad hoc excuses simply reveals that they're desperate to save their hypothesis from the evidence and not interested in the truth. That in itself is evidence that they're wrong. But the possibility of ad hoc excuses does mean that it's almost impossible to 100% disprove most hypotheses. Unless a hypothesis is false by definition, like bachelors are married, one can always make an excuse to save it from the evidence. For example, suppose I believe the world is flat. What evidence would you use to prove me wrong? Well, we've sailed all the way around the world. Well, the Earth is flat like a disc, and so those people were just sailing in a circle. Well, but we've taken pictures of the Earth from space and it's round. Those pictures were faked. Experts concluded that those pictures were not faked. Yeah, even better experts faked them. See, I can excuse away any evidence you give me. This, of course, does not make the belief that the world is flat rational. It definitely is not. That the Earth is round is still the best explanation for the evidence we have. My point is, with a few exceptions, it's possible to prove anything 100% false. People determined to protect their belief can always make excuses, but that doesn't make the belief rational. Now, of course, you might think that only dummies like flat earthers make this mistake. In reality, however, we're all apt to do it. This is one of the most common ways that people entrench themselves even deeper into their beliefs once they're proven wrong. After someone claims that vaccines cause autism, and then you roll out the overwhelming evidence that shows they're wrong, they're likely to shift their position to something that can't be tested. Like, well, I still have a right not to immunize my child. High intelligence doesn't prevent one from making such mistakes either. In fact, high intelligence can just make one more adept at coming up with creative ad hoc excuses. For example, in Starlight, Time, and the New Physics, creationist John Hartnett invokes Einstein's relativity and time dilation to try and explain how the Earth could be only 6,000 years old, despite the fact that light from distant galaxies is billions of years old. It's ultimately nonsense grounded in erroneous assumptions and misunderstandings of relativity, and it's clearly just an ad hoc excuse. But it took at least some understanding of relativity for him to generate it. And it is far more creative than many ad hoc excuses for creationism, like ad hoc excuses for the fossil record, like those fossils were planted by the devil. Okay, so when a hypothesis is testable, it makes observable novel predictions. But when a hypothesis is fruitful, it gets those predictions right. Our original gremlin hypothesis, for example, was testable, but it wasn't fruitful. It predicted the observation of tiny gremlins under the microscope, but that didn't occur. When I look out the window and see the tree swaying, my hypothesis that it's windy is both testable and fruitful. But simply getting one prediction right is not enough to confirm the truth of a hypothesis. After all, other factors may need to be taken into account. For example, the hypothesis that water always boils at 100 degrees centigrade might prove fruitful under certain experimental conditions. But if you varied the conditions of the experiment, the atmospheric pressure, the kind of water container, etc., you'd find that the boiling point of water varies widely. Indeed, by having drops of water float in other liquids, German scientist Georg Krebs was able to heat water to up to 200 degrees Celsius before it boiled. There could also be other hypotheses that predict the same observations. For example, a stomach ache is predicted by the hypothesis that you have stomach cancer. But it's also predicted by ulcers, gallstones, pancreatitis, and the flu. To confirm your stomach cancer diagnosis, you're going to have to make further successful predictions. You have to observe some symptom stomach cancer produces that the other conditions don't, like a tumor. The more successful predictions a hypothesis makes, the greater its confirmation. But there are also other criteria to take into consideration, like scope. The scope of a hypothesis is its explanatory power, how many diverse phenomena the hypothesis explains. How much does it unify our knowledge? The more a hypothesis explains, the more reason we have to think it's true. Now, giving a full philosophical definition of what it means to explain something is difficult, but in general, it's easy to tell when a hypothesis explains something and when it doesn't. One important thing to keep in mind when it comes to scope is that a hypothesis does not explain anything if it raises more questions than it answers, especially if those questions are unanswerable. Let me again borrow and modify an example from Schick and Vaughan. Suppose you're trying to explain why a bridge collapsed. And then someone suggests, well, I know what happened. An incomprehensible being zapped it with an incomprehensible force. Can you tell me anything about this being or force? You ask. No, they say. They're both incomprehensible. This is not helpful. This does not expand our knowledge. It certainly wouldn't help prevent the next bridge collapse. Even though this is a possible explanation, it isn't a good one and doesn't deserve serious consideration. Simply put, you can't explain the unexplained with the inexplicable. The criterion of simplicity is perhaps the most poorly named. It's also known as parsimony. An explanation being simple in the scientific sense does not mean that it's easy to understand. It means that the hypothesis does not invoke more assumptions, entities, or forces than necessary. Perhaps you've heard of Occam's razor, named after the 14th century philosopher and Franciscan friar William of Occam. He expressed it this way in his Summa Totius Logicae: it is futile to do with more things than that which can be done with fewer. The classic articulation, entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity, never appeared in his work, but they both express the same basic idea. The explanation that makes the fewest assumptions should be preferred. Simplicity plays an important role when abduction is used in the medical field. In fact, Occam's razor is actually the title of the 3rd episode of House MD. And Dr. House's guiding principle is Occam's razor. When a set of symptoms are expressed in a patient, one could explain each one of those symptoms with a separate disease. But the simpler explanation would be one disease that was causing all of the symptoms. All other things being equal, the simplest explanation is the best. Now, If your hypothesis assumes or requires something to exist that we already know exists, well, that's not really all that problematic. Primarily, it's the invention of new entities and forces to make a theory work that makes a hypothesis non-simple. This is another reason that the inexplicable being with an inexplicable force explanation is no good. It invokes two extra new entities, an inexplicable being and an inexplicable force, when neither one is needed. When we can explain the bridge's collapse by simply looking at the bridge itself, at what we already know exists, like its structure or its materials, well, then we should. Now, the last criterion is conservatism. Now, don't think politically conservative. In science, when something is conservative, it simply coheres with what we already know. It doesn't contradict already established knowledge. If something conflicts with expert opinion, or even worse, expert consensus, then it's not conservative. Now, that's not to say that we should always disregard a hypothesis if it contradicts what we already know. If we always did that, knowledge could never progress. However, if a hypothesis does contradict already established knowledge, then that's a strike against it. Unless it can overcome this handicap by being the most fruitful, wide-scoping, and simple hypothesis when compared to the conservative alternatives, it should likely be disregarded. Einstein's theory of relativity proved itself in this way. It was not conservative when it was first proposed because it contradicted Newton's theories, like Newton's suggestion that light always travels basically in straight lines and does not bend around massive objects. By correctly predicting that light does actually bend significantly around massive objects, thus by being both testable and fruitful, by further explaining the perihelion of Mercury when Newton's theory could not, thus giving Einstein's theory wider scope, and by explaining Newtonian gravity in terms of the curvature of space-time, and thus being simpler, Einstein's theory became the accepted one, despite the fact that it wasn't conservative. So, all in all, it is most rational to accept the best explanation, the hypothesis that is testable, most fruitful, has the widest scope, and is the simplest and most conservative. Of course, abduction is a form of induction, and so it's not a guarantee that the best explanation is the correct one. But the hypothesis abduction prefers is the most likely, and thus is the most rational for us to accept. After all, as we've already seen, the mere fact that something hasn't been 100% proven false is not a reason to think that it's true. That's appealing to ignorance. Now, abduction is going to be very useful to us throughout the course, but it's also very useful in everyday life. Schick and Vaughan do a very nice job of showing how abduction can be used to make rational sense of a whole host of weird phenomena. Ghost sightings, alien abduction, conspiracy theories, the list goes on and on. One phenomenon that is particularly useful to examine using abduction is homeopathy. You can buy homeopathic remedies over the counter in just about every pharmacy in the US, and many people have claimed to have felt better after taking them. Homeopathic remedies are developed using something called approving. You give a substance to someone and see what symptom it produces. Homeopaths claim that if you take that substance and dilute it in water, then a pill containing that water will cure that symptom. In fact, the more you dilute it, the stronger the effect becomes, even if not a single molecule of the original substance remain. So, did that bit of arsenic give you a stomachache? Well, then dilute that arsenic in water over and over and over again, and then put that water in a pill, and it will cure any stomachache you have. So, we can state the homeopathic hypothesis as such. A diluted version of any substance that causes a symptom can cure that same symptom. Or, as the homeopaths often put it, like cures like. What would applying abduction to this hypothesis reveal? Well, immediately you realize it's not conservative. Diluting something doesn't increase or reverse its effect. It decreases it. And it can't have any effect on anything if you dilute it into non-existence. To answer this criticism, now homeopaths claim that water can remember the essence of the substance it once contained. But that makes homeopathy lack simplicity. It's introducing two new assumptions, water memory and substance essences, to explain how the hypothesis could be true. And speaking of explanation, homeopathy lacks scope or explanatory power because it simply raises more questions than it answers. How can water remember if it doesn't have a brain? What is the essence of a substance? How does water remembering the essence of a substance reverse its effect? All this remains a mystery. It is basically invoking the inexplicable to explain the unexplained. Clearly, a simpler, wider scoping, and more conservative explanation would be that homeopathic cures are bogus and any effect they are thought to have is merely due to fallacious thinking or to the placebo effect. That's simpler because it invokes no extra entities. It's more conservative because it aligns with and doesn't contradict established knowledge. And it very nicely explains why some people feel better after taking homeopathic remedies. They believe it works, and so it seems to them that it does. Now, both hypotheses are testable. The homeopathic hypothesis predicts that homeopathic remedies will do better than placebos in well-controlled double-blinded studies. The "it's just a placebo" hypothesis would predict that there will be no such difference. So which hypothesis is fruitful? Which one gets the predictions right? You guessed it, the placebo hypothesis. Countless double-blind studies have been done, and in all of them, homeopathic remedies have the same effect as sugar pills. So, see, philosophy is very useful. Thanks to its development of abduction, you never have to waste your money on homeopathic remedies again. And now that we are armed with the tools of careful reasoning, we can start digging even deeper into the bigger questions of philosophy. And we'll continue with one of the biggest and most fundamental questions of all, one that lies at the center of what philosophers are seeking. What is truth?